it's Elle. Let's talk about the Broken Earth Trilogy by NK Jemisin. So you've heard about this series all over BookTube because everyone is reading it or has read it, and you haven't yet, like I hadn't yet, and you're wondering, is this series for me? Well, that's what I'm going to try to answer today. So let's get started. First, let's talk about the genre. So this is an environmental dystopian high fantasy. Of all the fantasy I've read, which granted isn't a ton, this one's atmosphere was very unique, felt very fresh, felt very lived in. Plot-wise, I don't really want to say much, but essentially in this environmental dystopian, this world has seasons, and these seasons are like natural disasters, but bigger scale. And at the start of the first book, we're entering into a new season. And that's really all I'm going to give you, and that's really all the back of the book gives you. I think it's good to go into this one fairly blind. Okay, so the difficulty of this book. I think that this lands more into the intermediate stage of high fantasy. If you're moving from YA and you're trying to get into adult fantasy, I don't think this is a really good gateway book. Not to say that you couldn't read it, but I think that what makes this a bit more difficult is the jargon of the series. So I would say that the jargon's also a plus. It makes the world feel very lived in. It makes it feel very realistic because she came up with all of these names for these new concepts she created. I think that on the flip side of that, it just makes it a way higher learning curve to actually get into the books because it's hard to keep up with it first. So as an example, the first one that I can think of is the Grishus Trilogy, and there's the character called the Darkling. And you know who the Darkling is. You know what the Darkling's going to do. It's kind of written in his name. It's very on the nose. A lot of the jargon that NK Jemisin comes up with in these books is not on the nose. So if you're a YA fantasy reader trying to get into high fantasy, this could be your starting point, but I wouldn't recommend it as the starting point. For readers of maybe literary fiction who like to also read fantasy or haven't really gotten into fantasy, I think it's fine to transition from being in a literary space to being in this space. While I get on the subject of difficulty, I kind of want to get into the writing style because the writing style isn't hard to read, and I don't want to make it seem like that's what makes this book difficult. I will caveat that some people are going to be turned off by the writing because a lot of the series is in second person. So it starts out with one of the characters' voices being in second person, and this goes through all of the series. And then there's some other character voices that are in third person. The second person is not always happening, so you're in the second person perspective, and it'll say things to you. It'll say, you did this and you did that, and remember how you were like this, and it has that sort of tone. But then sometimes there's actual plot going on, and the second person in those settings kind of pulls away and kind of just lets the plot go through. And so it feels more like third person within the second person space. I wouldn't be scared of it, but if you start reading it and you're not into it, I don't think you're going to like that. Let's talk about the pace of these books. I found, I guess, in the high fantasy I've read, I always expect them to be fast-paced. I expect there to be a lot of action. I expect there to be a climax, and then towards the end, and then it to kind of fall away and get some sort of resolution. This didn't follow those standards that I'm used to. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's just something to adjust to. I would call the pace of these books medium. They're pushing forward, but they're not pushing forward with any sense of urgency. And I think part of what makes these paced or feel like that pace is how they're broken up. So this is a trilogy. But I don't think that, how do I want to say this? I don't think that, it doesn't feel like a trilogy in the pacing of each of these books. It felt like I got to the end of book one and it felt like I finished part one of one long book. And I was getting on into the next part of the book. I guess I'm really talking more right now about the structure of the books. So the pacing kind of goes along with that, but the structure is it's such a way that it felt like one piece of literature instead of three different pieces of literature together. Keeping that in mind, if you read the first book and you don't feel inclined to keep going, you're not going to get the full resolution of the series. I feel like, for me, it feels like it would have been leaving a book partially finished. With respect to the pace, because the pace felt medium to me, normally I blast through a fantasy series. I just read one back to back to back, and I will blow through them in a week or two if it's really fast paced and I'm enjoying it. This took me a few months to read, and I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. Because the pace was slower, I was less inclined to pick it up as rapidly or read as much at a time, and I savored the world more, and I savored the space and the characters a bit more, and because of that, I finished this series over a month ago, and it's kind of stuck in my mind a bit more than other series have that I really flew through. Not everyone's reading experience of this series is like that. I was reading these at the same time as my mom, and she read them within the course of a week and a half, and was super excited for the next thing coming in each one, and found them, which I was also excited, but just in a slower, steadier setting. I like when a fantasy series, or a series in general, kind of opens up the world more as you go, so you get in the book, you get this first part that's interesting, and it's a good storyline, and it keeps you intrigued. And then in the books, as they progress, the world kind of builds upon itself, and I think that this series did that really well. You start with the season and and the characters and trying to get to grips with what's going on, and then as you get into the second and third books, more of the lore, more of the backstory of the world and why the world looks the way it does comes into play. And I'm glad that it was piecemeal to me and she didn't give that information up too early. Okay, hi. So I'm editing this review, and I just realized that I didn't talk about characters or the magic really at all, so I just wanted to get into that a little bit. The characters themselves, I guess maybe I didn't talk about it because I didn't have too much to say. I thought that they were interesting and complex. I liked that there was a lot of characters at different stages of life. I also really liked that one of the main characters was an older woman with children, which I haven't seen much in fantasy as them being the protagonist, so I really enjoyed that. And then farther along, you do have throughout them, you have POVs of children, which I thought were really well done. And there was a lot of conversations about dynamics between people, so dynamics in platonic relationships, in love relationships, in familial relationships, and that's a really key core message of this book, or maybe part of humanity that NK Jemisin kind of interrogates through her writing. So wanted to chime that in. Also, I didn't really talk about the magic system at all, which is, it feels so sci-fi because it's related to the earth, and people who have how do I describe the magic? It's like you can manipulate the earth in different ways, and I think there was a lot going on with it to the point where I didn't really totally understand it, and this is part where that I talked about where the lore kind of increases over time. So does the magic system. You learn more and more about it as it goes. What I really liked about this series too is that the magic is not favorable, so people who have this magic or are able to manipulate the earth are looked down upon and feared in society, and so they have to basically, a lot of the time when it's found that they're like, this is a child, they get killed. And they have to go to like a school to be trained, and they get trained to be used in society. So there's a lot of conversations around slavery, autonomy of individuals, how people are treated based on their abilities. And I think that there's a lot of conversation as well, because this is an environmental high fantasy. There's a lot of conversations around environmentalism. It feels like this is a thought project of climate change and where it could go in a fantastic setting. And then there's a lot of talk about race and classism. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that I'm not remembering and maybe I also didn't pick up on. So I'm going to link to a video of someone else's that I watched that I really liked, that I really appreciated their conversations. I'll link them below. But I think that's all I wanted to hop in and say, so back to the video when I had long hair. Okay, other things to keep in mind about this series. If you're looking for political intrigue, you won't find it here, so I wouldn't expect that. I think that overall, this series has a good resolution. I don't find those spoilery. I got a lot of the questions I had resolved. It felt like NK Jemisin knew what her intention was with her ending when she started writing these books, which you can't say for all series you read. It feels like you get to the end and it's like, what? That's what you decided to do? Okay, so that's all I got. If you've read the series, what did you think of it? Do you agree with me on my points? If you haven't read the series, did this make you want to? Did this make you not want to? Let me know. But that's all I got for today. So until next time, happy reading. Focus.